Lotus Elise, Lotus Exige. Elise, Exige. How many of the cosmetic and mechanical differences can you spot between the Series 2 Elise and the Series 2 Exige? Okay, so this video today is for the potential Lotus owners out there. Maybe you're considering an Exige or an Elise, and I'm going to try to answer a very popular and common question, which is what is the difference between an Elise and an Exige? Since I own both, I can actually show you side by side the differences. And honestly, I can hardly believe that I own both. If you had asked the 16-year-old me if I would own cars like this, I would have said probably not in a million years. Now, overall, the Exige just has a much more aggressive look. I mean, it's got the front splitter here, it's got a rear wing. The Elise is much more toned down in terms of its styling, no front splitter and no rear wing. Okay, so let's start with the exterior. Now, the front and rear clamshells on these two cars are actually different. They mount up exactly the same and they are interchangeable, but they are different in terms of design. Now, one subtle difference is that on the front clamshell of the Elise, there is this seam here to make it look like there's a bumper, but actually the clamshell is all one piece. But there's this seam here, and on the Exige, there is no seam. The rear clamshells are different as well, and they did the same thing on the Elise. They put a seam line here to make it look like there's a bumper, and on the Exige, there is no seam to look like a bumper. Another difference is the lip on the clamshell on the Elise. You can see there's a little seam kind of underneath here, and on the Exige, do we have that seam? No, there is no seam underneath here. Sticking with the back of the car, now this car has aftermarket rear taillights on, so kind of ignore that for a second. They did change the taillights throughout the years, but the taillights were always the same for the same years between the Exige and the Elise. Another little touch is these little sort of fake grills right here that are on the Elise. Those do not exist on the Exige, and you can see actually the recess here is a little bit of a different design compared to the clamshell on the Elise. One thing that is identical on the two cars is the mirrors, the doors, the windshield, the side windows. The doors are completely identical across both. Aiding to that kind of more aggressive look on the Exige, you can see that on the front it uses a lot of this mesh material in the front vents as well as here, compared to on the Elise, it uses these plastic vents in the front and plastic vents up here. So that is another difference between the two cars. All right, taking a look now at the roof panel. Now, all Elises came with a soft top roof just like this, and optionally you could get a hard top if you wanted. And if you got the hard top on the Elise, it mounted in the exact same way as the hard top that's on the Exige. So yes, that means that this top on the Exige can be removed. It's mounted and fixed the exact same way as the hard top for this car. One of the key differences though is that the hard top for the Elise doesn't have the scoop on it. This scoop here is actually a functional scoop, feeds air into where the intercooler is and the engine. On the early cars, the scoop came about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way to the front of the car. And on the later cars, the scoop came all the way to this front edge. And that is often referred to as the Mohawk scoop or the Mohawk roof. Another big difference on the two cars are the air intakes on the side. The Elises all had these kind of slats for the side intake, the side vents, and on the Exige, they had these scoops that, again, just looked a little bit more aggressive. They had these exposed mounting bolts here which some people really liked and thought they just, you know, looked really cool. Another cosmetic difference you may notice is this vent on the Exige here that's right behind the front wheel. This vent is present on the Exiges, and there is no vent like that on the Elise. I mentioned the Exige has a front splitter here, and the Elise has no front splitter. Also, the clamshell design is a little bit different. You can see there's sort of a thing for like a Euro license plate there, and it's a little bit wider and different on the Exige. Okay, now moving to the rear of the cars. Now the rear clamshell is probably the biggest visible difference because the Exige has this sloped rear line here, and the engine deck lid is up like this with, again, the same sort of mesh pattern that's at the front of the car, and obviously has the rear wing. Then when we look at the Elise, we have a flat engine cover here. It doesn't slope in the same way. And again, it has plastic slats covering the engine, and it actually has a usable rear window. As you can probably guess, the rear visibility on the Exige is basically non-existent, and you really just have to use the side mirrors to see anything behind you. And both of the cars, because of their design here, in the rain or when you're washing the car, yes, the engine gets wet. Water goes in through these. Water also goes straight into the engine through here. I should probably add that the sloped rear hatch on the Exige is actually designed because on a standard supercharged Exige, there's a big intercooler right here above the engine, and so it has to make room for it to fit that. You also get a little bit more trunk space because it's not flat, it's up. And so if you are carrying a helmet to a track day or something, it's much easier to fit it in the trunk of the Exige compared to the Elise, which obviously has these little recesses that go down and take up a little bit of trunk space, so it's hard to fit something helmet shaped in here. One thing that is ridiculous that I never quite understood is with this design, not being able to see out the rear, why do they even offer a rear view mirror? It does absolutely nothing. Another thing that I'll mention is that because the rear clamshells are different, obviously the location of the third brake light tends to be different. On the Exige, we have the third brake light right here in a very kind of conventional place, part of the clamshell, and on the Elise, the third brake light is actually tucked up here. Both of the cars have essentially the same rear diffuser. The ones on the Elise were typically bare aluminum, and the ones on the Exiges were typically, I don't know if they're anodized or painted black, but the diffusers on those are actually the same. Another thing that I'll note is the exhaust. So most of the Exiges had this kind of oval tip exhaust here that you can see, which I really, really like. I actually think that's a cool design, versus the Elises almost all had a dual tip exhaust like this. This is actually an aftermarket one, but the stock one looks just like this. It's just a little bit smaller. These little reflectors here are not so much an Exige versus Elise difference, but really a model year difference as well. You can see this Exige is a 2007 and it does not have those reflectors. They both have the exact same fuel filler door. Wheels are another thing that are different across the two cars, although these two cars happen to have the same wheels, same pattern. These are the Lotus Sport wheels, and they were part of the Sport package if you got the Sport package. Now on the Elise, it actually came with a different set of base wheels that were a different design. I'll put a photo of those. They were narrower in the front, and that created a little bit more understeer. So a lot of people upgrade to these ones if they're serious about taking their car to the track or something like that. The Exige did have some other wheel options later on in the model's life.
but the Lotus Sport wheels, the LSS wheels as these two are called, are definitely the most common. The headlights and turn signals on the car were basically the same. There were some changes throughout the years, but they were the same for each individual year across the Elise and the Exige line. The turn signal setup and the headlights were the same. Starting in 2007, the headlights became a sealed unit, and that's what these are. And they also added this little parking light up here. And on the S3 Elises, which are really rare in the United States, the headlight design is completely different. And in fact, the little turn signals here are no longer part of the design in that model. I think that was from 2011 onward. All right, let's take a look at the interior. The interior across the two cars is essentially the same. They have the same gauge cluster. It's a very no-frills interior. Door cards, seats, they're all manual transmissions. The climate control system here is exactly the same. There were differences in the radios that they supplied, and this one has an aftermarket stereo, but they all had a similar single DIN setup like this. The gauge clusters did change throughout the years, and eventually they switched to black-faced gauges, and so that is one difference, but again, it was consistent between the Elise and the Exige, just more dependent on what year it was. Things like the start-stop button, all the controls, the steering wheel, all of that is exactly the same. And let's take a look at the Exige interior so you can see it actually is really the same setup, the same steering wheel, the same buttons and controls. In my Elise, I actually changed this to carbon fiber as well as the surround around the climate controls. And then there was this little cubby back here that you can store something in. And I don't know if you can see it, but there is a little mesh net back here that came as part of the touring package just up against the firewall. Now, one thing that was different was the seats for the Exige. They all had the harness pass-throughs here, and on the Elise, they did not. There's not really any glove compartment or anything here. There's just sort of a shelf that you can put some stuff on. And they all had the same little aluminum footrest for the passenger. Again, door cards, essentially the same. Door cards on the Elise, same. And you can see no pass-throughs for harnesses, although on my driver's side, I did have those installed. I was a little bit too nervous to cut through the leather, so I had a shop put those in for me. And you can see this is the carbon fiber pieces that I added. And then this is a cup holder, which is also aftermarket that I added. If you had the track pack, it came with a harness bar as well. This is an aftermarket harness bar, but the track pack included this. A couple other little things. If you had the touring package, it came with carpeting along the side here and carpeting under the seats and behind on the firewall, which I don't know if you can really see there. But there's carpeting there, there's carpeting down underneath the seats as well. And it had some additional sound deadening, which still wasn't very much. Touring package also had power windows and the leather seats. You could get cloth seats, and the cloth seats are actually pretty nice because they're very grippy and you don't slide around very much. I mean, these are buckets, so you don't slide too much anyway. And if you got the cloth seats, you typically got roll-up windows as well if you had the cloth seats. Here's a better look at the climate control system. Super basic, very, very simple interior. Okay, let's talk about the engines for a minute. Now, both the engines they're kind of the same, but they're kind of different because both cars use a Toyota 2ZZ engine. Now, this is the same engine that's found in the Celica GTS. I think it's found in the Matrix XRS and the Corolla XRS. as well as maybe the Pontiac Vibe GT. So it's a 4-cylinder from Toyota, about 190 horsepower. It's a 1.8 liter engine. Now, generally speaking, most Elises are naturally aspirated. So it's just the 2ZZ engine, totally naturally aspirated. And again, this is a broad generalization, whereas most Exiges are supercharged. But there is a caveat to that. The 2006 Exiges were all naturally aspirated. So a 2006 Exige and a naturally aspirated Elise have the exact same setup and are essentially the same car, but with different bodywork. In 2007, Lotus started putting superchargers on the Exiges. The Elise also got an optional supercharger starting in 2008 as the Elise SC, and that put out about 217 horsepower, and it did not have an intercooler because obviously there was no space for an intercooler in this clamshell design. So again, starting in 2007, all Exiges were supercharged from the factory, and normally there would be a big intercooler here. This particular one has an aftermarket supercharger that does away with the intercooling system. But 2007 and newer Exiges were about 220 horsepower, and then they changed the model name from what was called the Exige S here, and then they started calling them like the Exige 240, the Exige 260, and that stood for the amount of horsepower that the engine was making, 240 or 260 horsepower. And if it's just a regular Exige S, such as this 2007, it would have made about 220 horsepower from the factory. Again, generally speaking, most Exiges are supercharged and most Elises are naturally aspirated. As I mentioned, this one has a BOE supercharger kit, which does away with the big intercooler here. It is a bigger supercharger and more efficient, and apparently doesn't need the intercooling system. This kit supposedly puts out about 300 horsepower at the crank. More on the mechanicals between the two cars. They both came with 6-speed transmissions. You could get an optional limited slip differential, but it was a pretty rare option and was not equipped on many cars. Lotus did a lot of testing at their Hethel racetrack at the factory, and they found that a limited slip didn't really offer that much advantage in terms of lap time, so the default setting was no limited slip, but you could get it, and it was a Toyota limited slip as part of the 6-speed transmission from Toyota. Both cars weigh right about 2,000 pounds, which is pretty light, so you really do feel the increased power in a noticeable way. In fact, I usually joke with people that I can definitely feel the weight of a passenger in this car, in how the car handles, and even the difference between a full tank of gas and an empty tank of gas. You can really notice the difference on a car that only weighs about 2,000 pounds. The Elise is typically around 100 pounds lighter than the Exige, primarily due to the different clamshells and the supercharger. Now, both cars have double wishbone suspension front and rear, but the springs and shocks did vary depending on which package your car had. Now, cars that didn't have the track pack came with these adjustable remote reservoir, at least in the front, Bilstein shocks. But if you did not have the track pack and you just had the base suspension, which is what my Elise originally came with, you just had non-adjustable Bilstein shocks. And there was also something that was a very popular option called the Sport Pack, which also the shocks were still non-adjustable Bilsteins, but they had a different spring rate and the dampers were different. The ride height was a little bit lower, and all of those Sport Pack cars had dual oil coolers in the front. The oil coolers are located right inside these vents on the side. They're sort of like right in front of the front wheel behind this piece of the clamshell right here. Now, the early Elises, whether you had the Sport Pack or not, had dual oil coolers. My car is not a sport package car, and it does have the dual oil coolers because it's a very early build. But also on the sport package cars, the ride height was a little bit lower.
Now on my Elise, I actually have the single adjustable Penske shocks, so it's a totally aftermarket suspension setup.
And there were a couple of special editions that came with Öhlins suspension, and that was the Elise Sport, and I think all of the 2010 and newer Exiges. They had Öhlins suspension if you had the track package. All right, so let's look at the brakes. Front brakes were 2-piston AP calipers on both the Exige and the Elise, certainly in the early days, and then they had a single piston rear caliper here. Again, same on both cars. But later with the Exige, starting in 2008, they switched to a 4-piston front caliper and the rears remained the same. The brake rotors on the 4-piston one also increased to 308 millimeters. Both of these cars have aftermarket rotors on them. The original rotors were cross-drilled. One of the really crazy things that Lotus did was they put the same rotors on both the left and right side of the car, which meant that the internal cooling vanes were actually the wrong direction on one of the sides. So if you get an aftermarket or if you have to replace your rotors, usually they fix that and there's an actual right and left side rotor. All right, there you go. That pretty much covers it, I think, but I might have missed some stuff. So let me know down in the comments if there are more differences between the Elise and the Exige that I may have missed. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and now you can point out some of these subtle differences to your friends who don't really know probably even what a Lotus is. Thanks for watching.